In the fall of 1962, the USSR installed nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, which started a conflict known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the closest the world has ever gotten to nuclear warfare, as the US went up to DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear war. In this conflict, without diplomacy and negotiation, there would be no compromise, as it may have ended the world we know today. In this documentary, we will explain the Cuban Missile Crisis, its significance, and connection to the theme, conflict and compromise. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the United States during the Cold War. The people involved in the conflict was John F. Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro. They were the leaders of the three main countries involved in the crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis started on October 16th and ended on October 28, 1962. It all began because the Soviet Union implemented missiles in Cuba, which had an ideal range to hit mainland U.S. and Washington, D.C. They were able to put missiles in Cuba because Cuba turned to communism and cut ties with the U.S. The Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba because they were afraid about Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy that the U.S. implemented. They were afraid about this because Jupiter missiles could hit Moscow. So, to level the playing field with the U.S., they sent some of their own ballistic missiles to Cuba. In this conflict, both countries could have wiped each other off the face of the planet with the push of a button. But because of mutually assured destruction, that did not happen. Mutually assured destruction prompted both sides to resolve the conflict, and they ended the conflict with a peace treaty in which stated that the United States would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy, and the Soviet Union would remove their missiles from Cuba. This incident was a very horrifying conflict that could have brought an end to the world as we know it, but thanks to compromise and mutually assured destruction, the world was saved from nuclear warfare. The missile crisis happened because the U.S. had Jupiter missiles in both Turkey and Italy, which had an ideal range to strike the Soviet Union. This made the Soviet Union very, very afraid. This is why they allied with Cuba to put missiles there. Because at that time, once an ally of America, Cuba turned into a communist nation, therefore making an enemy of the U.S. The U.S. tried to take Cuba in an invasion called the Bay of Pigs, but the U.S. failed. They lost. Due to the invasion, Cuba sought alliance from the Soviet Union. This led to the Soviet Union bringing missiles to Cuba, making it an ideal range for the Western Hemisphere and leveling the playing field that the U.S. had with the Soviet Union.
The missiles in Cuba were medium-range ballistic missiles that were transported securely to Cuba by Soviet ships. The missiles were able to hit a large range, mainly North and South America. As John F. Kennedy says in his speech explaining the crisis, ranging as far north as Hudson Bay in Canada and as far south as Lima, Peru. He states in that speech that it could strike most major cities in the Western Hemisphere. As seen in previous history of the U.S., the American government reacts very quickly to any threats. When the U.S. found out about the missiles being sent to Cuba, it immediately reacted with a blockade around the island with warships. Khrushchev said that the U.S. was not allowed to do that according to UN laws, but the U.S. replied with a statement saying that it is a small quarantine. When the creation of missiles kept on continuing, John F. Kennedy had no other choice but to go to DEFCON 2, the closest the U.S. ever was to nuclear war, which is one step away from nuclear war. From the side of the U.S., it was John F. Kennedy, Rudolph Anderson, and Robert Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States and the President during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Rudolph Anderson was in the Air Force, and he was the only person that died because of the Cuban Missile Crisis on a spy plane because the Cuban officials shot his plane down while he was spying on Cuba to maintain secrecy. Attorney General Robert Kennedy played a key factor in this crisis by having a secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador for peace. From Cuba was mainly Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba that turned it into a communist nation. He was the person that sparked the whole conflict. From the Soviet Union, it was Nikita Khrushchev, Vasily Arkhipov, and Anatoly Dobrynin. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was exiled because the Soviet leaders didn't like that he struck a deal with the U.S. Vasily Arkhipov was a Soviet Navy officer who is known in history mainly for saving the world by voting against shooting the U.S. with a nuclear torpedo. Finally, there's Anatoly Dobrynin, who is a Soviet ambassador who had a secret meeting with Robert Kennedy, who was stated above.
These were the people that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis and who stopped the world from being destroyed.
This was the closest the world ever was to nuclear warfare in history. It showed how important peace and diplomacy is in our government and our world. It also showed us the power of mutually assured destruction and how it could tame the two superpowers of its day. There were so many close calls that could have ended our world we know today. This made all countries a lot more cautious about nuclear warfare. This was the first time the world has been that close to nuclear warfare, and hopefully the last.
The Cuban Missile Crisis connects to the theme conflict and compromise in many ways. The whole crisis is arguably one of the biggest conflicts in the Cold War, with being at the verge of nuclear war and the end of losing all their allies and advantages. However, this colossal conflict had a great compromise. It was one of the best compromises in history, since the stakes were so high that it was either peace or the end of the world. But both sides were able to agree on one peace treaty with the help of the U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador of the Soviet Union, Anthony Dolenbos. They had a secret meeting for peace in Washington, D.C., because they intensely spoke and came back to the agreement that the U.S. should take down their missiles in Turkey and Italy and never attack or invade Cuba, and the Soviet Union would withdraw their army and missiles from Cuba. This compromise was hard to meet, since John F. Kennedy refused to take down Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy at first. But luckily, later, John F. Kennedy decided to take down the missiles after the secret meeting and think what the best choice and sent the letter to Khrushchev. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the only conflicts to have been so short, but to have the most dramatic effect in history and the best compromise.
Immediately after the treaty, John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev were in hot water. The American people were very angry because they viewed this as John F. Kennedy negotiating with the enemy. This was all over the news and television at the time. Nikita Khrushchev was in trouble as well. The people of the Soviet Union and their elites were outraged. However, those were only immediate consequences. The long-term effects would only be known later. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and making deals with the Soviet Union made the assassinator want to kill him even more. Nikita Khrushchev was exiled from being a leader of the Soviet Union after officials decided to let him go because he made a deal with the enemy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, things were going well. The family of Vasily Arkhipov, the Soviet Navy officer who is known for saving the world, was awarded the Future of Life Award to honor humanity's late hero at a ceremony in London on October 27, 2017. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the best ways to show conflict and compromise because Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin agreed on a compromise to end the conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without the compromise between Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin, the conflict would have endangered the whole world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the best example of conflict and compromise in history.